继续，当然是继续，
First of all, I would like to begin by welcoming, in particular, all of the nuns who've come to our spring teachings, as well as all of my Dharma friends who are listening over the internet. I wish you well, and I hope you're doing well. So, within the autobiographical verses, good deeds, today we'll speak about the 27th and the 28th good deeds. And according to the outline from the meaning commentary by the attendant Sanjay Paldra, we're in the passage practicing on how we practice the path of the created individual. This has the intention rousing bodhicitta, the action meditating on the two types of bodhicitta, and third, how he trained in the precepts of the two types of bodhicitta. And among these, we're speaking about the third, how he trained in the precepts. And this has 7 subtopics. And the first of this how he trained in the 6 transcendences and so forth. I don't need to reach each of them. And so the last of these is how the 6 clairvoyances give him the ability to benefit others. So these are the 7 subtopics. So now among these 7, where we're at is on the second, how he trained in purifying his own continuum. This is the second of the subtopics, how he trained in purifying his own continuum. Now, the root text for this passage on how he trained in purifying his own continuum is in the good deeds, versus the good deeds. It reads, as long as you hang on to your intractable character, you will not tame the mind streams of your followers. So I focused on my own accumulation and purification to increase accumulation and purification among my students. I think of this as one of my good deeds. Now you can all hear me, right? Now, among the 33 good deeds in the autobiographical versus good deeds, at this point, this is the 27th of the good deeds. And now, the other day, I spoke about this 27th good deed as presented in Mikyo Dorji's own instructions and training in his liberation story. So today I'd like to speak about it as it is discussed in Sanjay Paldra's commentary in the meaning. And so what it says is that from the old days until the present, within society, there are said to be great beings who are said to be unrivaled in getting others to serve the 3 jewels and bring defenseless to happiness, and who are very good at teaching the path to excellence. So these are said to be lamas or great beings who are able to bring beings great benefit. They're called spiritual friends or lamas or so forth. There are quite a few of these, and some of them are in actuality. They're actually the actuality, live up to their names. Some of them, though, just have big, great names, but in actuality are not really like that. There are quite a few like that. And so what happens with many of them, as I said, is that the name and the actuality is different. They have a very impressive name, like a spiritual friend, a teacher of the excellent path. They have the name of a lama, but in actuality, in order for them to bring others to the path of virtue, they themselves they should be able to recognize for themselves what the opposite of happiness is, or virtue is, that non-virtue, but they aren't able to do this. And with such a lama like that, or someone called a spiritual friend, and it's just like a dry name. They say that they're a lama or say that they're a spiritual friend. And so they get them to do things. They teach them about practicing virtue. They speak very well. They speak about these excellent things, such as about how to practice the 10 virtues and so forth. And so then once they get a faith and respect of people, once they get a certain amount of respect and a certain amount of renown, then what they do, and once they become well known, they don't continue teaching people with a pure intention how to practice virtue. Instead, they get them to practice a unvirtuous behavior. Another main reason why for this is that for they themselves, is that they don't really have certainty what non-virtue is. They don't recognize that it's not good and that it's bad. Because they do not know this, then they get others to do unvirtuous things and get them to commit offenses and wrongs. And so these are these people who are said to be lamas or spiritual friends don't really unable to see the faults of unvirtuous factor. They don't see unvirtuous behavior. They don't see the problem. And so they instead get others to practice these unvirtuous. Now, the opposite of this is someone like Mikyo Dorje. The way he thought about this is that in order to tame other sentient beings, in order to sort of cleanse or to improve someone else's mind stream, then first you need to tame yourself. You need to cleanse your own mind stream. If you do know that, if you haven't tamed your own mind straining, then there's just no way that you can cleanse anyone else's mind stream. Likewise, if you do not think even the slightest about the needs of the next and future lifetimes, and only think about the happiness of this lifetime, you only think about these, so instead of doing things for the real long-term, the lasting benefit for future long-term lifetimes, but instead you focus on the short-term benefit for this lifetime. And if you look at it on the outside, it might seem that they have a conduct of a bodhisattva, but seem like they benefit others. But because what they're thinking about is this life only, then what they did that seems to benefit others is actually only a pseudo-benefit for others. The bodhisattva action that they do is actually only a pseudo-bodhisattva action. This is, like I said the other day, it is like a leper teaching a Garuda sounder. They're doing something they can't do. Leprosy is, in the past, it's an illness that many people caught in the past. Now, this is a disease that is now more or less eradicated from the world. They can actually cure it with medical treatments. So there are not as many people who have not as many leprosies. But in the previous times, leprosy was people would be infected with leprosy, and then you'd be separated from society, be prevented from coming back. You had to stay separately from others. So a really terrible illness. Now, the way that it's seen in Tibetan, the way Tibetans think about it, or the traditional way it's thought about, that this leprosy is a Naga illness. Now, the antidote for a Naga is a Garuda sign. So the antidote for Naga is a Garuda, so there are many different Garuda sadhanas. And if you practice those, then they can be an antidote for the Nagas and can overcome the Naga illness. But if someone is infected with leprosy, and if that person infected with leprosy that would then teach or introduce the Garudasana to another person, then the other person, what they're going to think is, if he actually knows that Garuda practice so well, then he should practice it himself. Why isn't he able to free himself of leprosy? Why can't he do that? And so you think, oh, he must not know how to practice the Garudasana, and then in addition, then I might catch leprosy. So they get a little bit, they have suspicions. And so you wouldn't really believe or feel comfortable with the other person. So if near the depths of your mind you're thinking about nothing other than this lifetime, but on the outside it seems like you're doing some bodhisattva activity or doing great things for the benefit of others, it may look like that, but in actuality, since you don't really have bodhicitta, or don't really have a true Altosh feeling of attitude, then it's difficult for it to be something that's satisfying and fulfilling. So the main point of that is that if you haven't tamed your own being, then there's absolutely no way that you can tame others. In order to bring vast benefit to other sentient beings and to practice true Dharma, if you wish to do that, then it's very important to think about the next and future lives. So Mykhyel Dorje saw this is a critical point. And Mykhyel Dorje then thought about what is the most important point of the instructions for purifying other sentient beings and the subtle points of voice. So he thought about it, and he clearly understood what was the main critical point. So what is it that prevents us from picking what we should do and what we should not do? You need to be able to teach other people what they should do and what they should not do. And if you're unable to teach that, then you may say a lot of different words, but you will still not be able to really point it out to others. But if you know the actual main point, you know that one main point, then you can explain it in ways that people can understand. And then if you apply that one antidote, then it's like you can be an antidote for everything. And when you block one obscuration to discard, then all that discards all of them. It's like this a profound critical point. And generally, it's something that even people with ordinary individuals, little diligence and dull factors of weak prajna, such people are basically unable to realize this directly. It's difficult for them even to have a mere conceptual idea of what it means. But this is a really important, critical point that Mykhyel Dorje himself knew. Not only did he know this critical point, he also practiced it. He developed real experience and in his mind. And that experience wasn't just merely that he got a feeling and so on, but he had real certainty in his experience. So he gained experience, a certainty in experience, and then he reached the ultimate level of practice, and only then would he teach that Dharma to others. So it's like for us, like an ordinary person, well before you're unable to have a good understanding, and then you just we taught other people, even without this understanding, we told them, oh, you shouldn't do this. We were kind of audacious in speaking like this. But Mykhyel Dorje himself had a very good understanding of the main point of the Dharma he's teaching. And once he'd gained that, then he was not satisfied with only that mere understanding. he put it into practice as according to his understanding and developed experience. The experience that he developed was to not just it's a kind of hazy feeling in his mind. It's like a real certain, definite feeling, the experience of having real certainty. And so this is the Dharma that he felt real certainty in, that he was able to teach to other beings. Otherwise, then forget about practicing Dharma yourself in your own being. Forget about incorporating the Dharma into your being. There are a lot of other people who haven't even tried to see whether they can incorporate in their being. They haven't got some sort of a rough idea of this. They haven't even got a basic idea of what that is. And they think it's enough to get some empowerments and transmissions and to see the words and the text. To read them, they think, oh, that's enough. I understand. Well, okay, and they recognize it. They find so many of us like that. Say, oh, I understand. I know what the main point. I know how to practice the Dharma, we say. So we think of it this way, and say we say a lot of things out of just overconfidence. So you go to a different place and say, oh, I'm going to go teach a winter teaching, go teach a summer teaching. And I'm going to have many students who are going to go into retreats, and many students are practicing retreats. I'm going to make them all go into sealed retreats, and they say this, make them go make medicine days, and they say all these really impressive things and teach like this, but in actuality, for themselves, and forget about even bringing out some experiments, they haven't even tried to see whether they can develop experience. And forget about having a complete understanding of the Dharma. They don't even have a partial understanding. And so I think that the empowerments and the inspections that the Lama recites the text, the Lama gives a few teaching transitions, and they look at the written text, and when they see the written text, they think, oh, I see, I understand, they say. And they feel, and they're satisfied with that, and then they're overconfident and run around teaching. So in brief, no matter how much Dharma they teach, they try to say how many Dharmas they have. They aren't thinking about the quality. They don't look at the level of the understanding of Dharma that the people that develop. Think about how many times they've taught it, how many empowerments they've taught, how many transitions they give. They count these, they total these up. And then they see how many students have got 100 or 1,000, and they count that. And so when they get 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, they think, oh, this is incredible. And then while they're giving the empowerments and give transmissions, you see how many offerings they got, how much respect and how much gain they may get, how many offerings they received. But to think like that is not at all good. Without looking to see whether the student has incorporated the being into beings or not. So you have to, instead of looking at how many offerings, what change has come about in the student? What benefit? How have they improved? What have they learned? But instead of thinking of those primarily, they think, how much Dharma they taught? How many empowerments have they given? What transmissions have they given? How many people came? That's what they think about it. This is a bad way of acting. Dorje says, like, this is like the bandits who are destroying the Dharmas. So like they're the bandits or the highwaymen who destroy the Buddha's teachings. And so not the way of the work of someone who upholds the teachings. And Mikkyö Dorje himself considered such a way of acting as bad. And And so at all times, he just held back, refrained from doing this as much as he could. So you could say that he was refraining from it. He just wouldn't do it ever. Never in any circumstance. So when we think about the way the authentic gurus give instructions, if we think what they do is that they first have to see, you have to incorporate the Dharma into your being, and then you see if you can you get others to incorporate the Dharma into their beings. This is the way it should be done. Taking the primarily whether you've incorporated the Dharma into your being or not. And so that's what you take as most important. For example, especially with the authentic gurus of the Dakapa Kagyu gurus, when you look at how they gave their instructions, was actually, as I said, the reason why this is so is that Lord Gampopa said this in a quote, and if we understand that, we'll understand. So first I'll recite his what he said. So the quote from Gampopa said, "In the future, when gurus have no experience and students no devotion in the gurus, when they just give instructions as transmissions, my teachings will disappear." This is what Gampopa said. So the way we should understand this is like in the future. So in future times, there'll be a situation, and what the situation will be is that the gurus themselves won't have any experience of incorporating the Dharma in their own beings. The students to whom they teach the Dharma will have no faith or devotion in the Lama or the Dharma. So you have a guru with no experience. The Lama has no practice of the Dharma or no experience or realization of the Dharma. And the students have no faith and devotion in the Dharma or the Lama. But they pretend to be giving instructions and giving transmissions. They act as if they're teaching the Dharma, but this will happen. And the time when this happened, at that time, when that happens, what it shows is that my teachings will have disappeared. Gampopa, his teachings, the teachings is a sign that the Dakapa Kagyu Temple teachings have disappeared. Now, the sign that the Dakapa Kagyu teachings are there is that you have a guru who has the experience of the teachings, who have incorporated in them beings and students. So you have the Buddha you have the guru with the blessings and the students with devotion. And then the Dharma will be the Dharma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And that is a sign that the actual teachings of the Dakapa Kagyu are still extant. And if it's the opposite, then forget about the lamas having any blessings. They don't even have any experience of the Dharma. The students have absolutely no devotion, but in addition to that, they pretend to be gurus and students. And they say, we're giving instructions and giving transmissions. When you get to that time, then that's a sign that the Dakapa Kagyu teachings have disappeared. So this is Gampopa's words. Likewise, Lord Trisum Khenpo and Palma Drupa and his disciples also said exactly the same thing. Gutsangpa and his disciples also, what they said, I've never taught anyone a single word of Dharma that I have not practiced and gained experience in myself. So what this is saying is that Gutsangpa, so the Lord Gutsangpa and his disciples, so it says like Yangompa and his other disciples. So this is what they said. What they said is that if I haven't practiced in Dharma, if I haven't incorporated it into my beings and developed experience of it, and they say, I've never taught such, even a word of such Dharma to anyone else. Even if I teach someone only a single word, but it's everything I teach is words that I've practiced, and then I've gained experience from it, and then I teach it to others. So if I just dry words without having first practiced and gaining experience in them, they've never done this, they say. And what this shows is that the Dharma that they teach is all experiential Dharma. It's not dry words, they're moist words. They've developed real experience of what the Dharma actually is in their being, and so they're teaching. They're just saying that they aren't teaching just dry, empty words. So Mikyo Dorje himself, Mikyo Dorje repeated himself, so speak about these words to others. He'd say, you have to teach Dharma like this, he'd say. If you're going to teach Dharma, you must teach it like this. If you're going to teach Dharma, you have to teach it like this. And he'd say this over and over again to his students. And he himself held the examples of the Kagyu formas to be authoritative. And he looked to see if he could be able to do the same thing himself. And so that whatever Dharma he was teaching to his students, first of all, he considered it really important. He really valued it. It wasn't just something that just wasn't enough to be able to spout it out orally. It had to be Dharma that's going to benefit the student in this and future lifetimes. And so if we teach that, then you consider that to be really important. So he first developed experience of it. He practiced it and developed experience and understand it. He tried to see, could he do this? And then, once he had gained experience and understanding, then only then would he teach it to his students. And for this reason, Mikyo Dorje's students considered every single word of his teachings or his advice to be extremely important. The reason is because he considered it to be so important. Even if he only taught his students a single word, he thought that this has to be a word that's going to benefit the other person, this in future lifetimes, in other lifetimes. He considered it very important. He had to have like experience and understanding. He tried to see, could he develop the understanding? And only then, when he had the experience, would he teach it to others. And because of that, then the students understand how important Mikyo Dorje considered it, then they considered it extremely important. In particular, one real quality of Mikyo Dorje is that he had his students do a lot of accumulation and purification in order to make themselves into beings very receptive to the Dharma, able to actually practice. Not only did he make other people practice accumulation and purification, he also himself, in order to benefit others, he himself also worked very hard at accumulation and purification. For example, like when Mikyo Dorje did prostrations, the way that Mikyo Dorje did prostrations, the way he made a mandala, if we look at the way he did that, so the way that he had real devotion to the three jewels, the way he served the three jewels. And this is not something that we can see these days. When his students saw this, when they felt real certainty of him, they had a really incredible feeling. Just looking at the way Mikyo Dorje did prostrate, they had this feeling, oh, if you're going to prostrate, this is how you have to prostrate. If you're going to make an offering to the three jewels, then you have to make an offering like this. They had this like really special feeling that this is how you're to do this. And Mikyo Dorje himself was actually extremely skilled at getting his students to be able to practice accumulation, purification, and thus he's very good at giving advice. He himself did a lot of accumulation, and this really had a great influence on his students. And what Mikyo Dorje himself said, this is a really important point. Now, I'm not going to read it every word, but to give like the main points. What he said was, the guru should really worry about are they going to actually be able to tame the students' afflictions. These worries are something that should actually they should even be able to feel these worries in their dreams. They should dream about their worries about whether they're going to be able to tame their students' afflictions. So a lama should be someone who really worries about can they tame their students' afflictions or not. Otherwise, if there are people who kind of entrust themselves to, kind of devote themselves, and if you try to make them to turn out well in this life, to turn out to not have a hard time in this lifetime, if you're only worrying about that, then that is not the actual work of a lama. That's not the real work of a lama. They're worrying about whether something's going to turn out well for others, if they're going to be happy in this lifetime, is something that even worldly leaders will do. Like parents, I always think of them, if they don't have a bad time, I hope that they turn out well. And parents worry about this. And in the old days, it talks about lords and subjects, right? You have lords and subjects, and the lord would worry about their subjects. They sort of oversee their subjects and see if they could fulfill their wishes. They'd worry about the wishes of their subjects. So if there's someone who's only worrying about the happiness and the joys and sorrows of this lifetime, then it's not the work of a lama. The lama's work is primarily to see whether they can tame the afflictions in a student's being or not. They shouldn't necessarily be worrying about whether they're going to get food and clothing and so forth. This is something that worldly parents and worldly leaders are able to do, and this is not something that it's not a particular responsibility of a lama. So the main responsibility of a lama is to see whether they are able to tame the student's mind stream or not. If they can take it like leather, if they can make it soft and supple, that's what they should work at. That's what they should worry about. That's what you need someone who's going to take that responsibility. So this is the responsibility of the lama. Now for the students, now if they don't have any guile or deceit, if they can really trust themselves to the lama fully, and have the feeling that if you aren't going to do this for me, lama, then who is? And sort of devote themselves to the guru as their lasting refuge. Someone is going to be able to give giving them direction for into the future lives. Say, you are my refuge and my hope for this and future lifetimes. You have to have this devotion, this level of confidence in the guru. And if you don't have that, then that student is really a student. And even if you give offerings, a heap of offerings the size of Mount Meru, it doesn't benefit. And even if you take teachings of the entire Dharma of the three Vehicle without missing even a single letter, you get all of the empowerments that you can get. You get all the transmissions. There's no benefit to it. So in brief, in order for the Dharma to be true, it has to be for the sake of future and next and future lifetimes. You need to be thinking about future lifetimes, thinking about the next lifetime. You need to be working for the sake of, your aim should be for the sake of the next and future lives. If you're only for the sake of this lifetime, then no matter what you do, then it will not help the student achieve the higher states of the true excellent. They won't have any chance or any opportunity. And the reason for this is the higher states is a question of the future lives. And so from one perspective, we talk about achieving the unified state of Vajradhara in this lifetime, but when you think about this, This is not a question of achieving something for the sake of this lifetime, but it's a different way of thinking. But if you only think about doing something for the sake of this lifetime, if you're not thinking about other future lifetimes at all, then it's difficult to actually practice genuine Dharma. So that's what Mikkyö Dorje says. And as he said, hey, that's what he taught, and not only did he say that, but also in his life story, he had no attachment to sensory pleasures. He was never distracted by diversions and so forth. He had no interest in the 8 concerns of the world. He never had any he never tried to fool or deceive other people. He never acted like a charlatan. This just naturally occurred. This naturally stopped. Likewise, he never taught any lies about superhuman qualities or wrong dharma. And when he had a mistake, when Mikkyö Dorje made a fault or a wrong, he said, "This is my fault. This is my mistake." And he said he accepted. He accepted that his mistakes were mistakes, and he swiftly confessed them. And so he'd confessed them with regret. For example, Mikkyö Dorje is a really very direct person. As his nature is just really direct. So if you read his texts, so at that time in Tibet, he made a lot of refutations of older lamas, previous lamas in Tibet. But if there's someone who says that there is somebody, but there are many things he said that where he said there were wrongs, that there were, he made some refutation that he said were wrong, and he said that he had then later confessed. So a lot of Tibetan scholars who make refutations, but they don't later say it was wrong and then confess them. Mikkyö Dorje himself didn't, make his confessions in some eloquent sort of way. It's like he was recognizing the faults that were his faults. Like he really cleared to himself that his wrongs were wrongs, and he confessed them. This is a really particular quality. In any case, Mikkyö Dorje himself, when he taught Dharma to people, if he hadn't developed any experience and understanding, then he would teach them. He didn't teach people Dharma that he didn't have experience and understanding in. He would only teach Dharma who had the right fortune. He wouldn't teach the profound Dharma to just anyone. And so some people who had kind of misunderstandings, they kind of criticized Mikkyö Dorje. What they said is Mikkyö Dorje, when he gives them, he's really strict about them. He just won't give them. He's just too tight with them. It's like he's too tight with empowerments. He doesn't have the ability, doesn't have what it needs to give empowerments. It's like he doesn't need it. He doesn't give them easily. And he has knowledge is too limited. He hasn't studied that much. Other great teachers have studied a lot of different empowerments and scriptures, but Mikkyö Dorje hasn't studied that much. When he gives instructions, you can't give him, forget him to finish giving instructions. He never teaches the instruction from beginning to the end. So a lot of people who criticized him in this way, it's said. So there are people who spoke like this. But it's like just a way that they're speaking, or the fact that they didn't have the right fortune. For those who have the fortune, we just a little bit of his, if just give like an example with his body, or say a single word, would inspire teach them something, and just give them real expenses. We're talking about the wish for liberation from samsara, faith in the 3 jewels, or carefully choosing what to do and what not to do in karmic cause and effect, or training and strengthening bodhicitta, or training in the paths and levels. It was really beneficial for people in terms of really gaining new understandings and learning something. And so for this reason, Mikyo Dorje's life and example, and the way he taught his students, the way he taught his students, if you understand, if you think there's, you can begin to think that like there's no one else on this earth that can possibly guide me to this level of omniscience or to really show me the path to Buddhahood. So people would feel real comfortably around, and that they would feel reassured about this, and so they could develop real certainty in. And they could think that Mikyo Dorje really is a Lama that I can trust and that will teach me. And many students had this really great certainty. And so there were quite a few, maybe not a whole lot of them, but actually Mikyo Dorje himself, this is like one of his great qualities, or one of his. There really weren't that many people who could understand his full example, but there were a few. And so these few really saw that he thought that these people who could guide them on the path to liberation, on the path to liberation and omniscience, they thought that there's no one who could teach them better than Mikyo Dorje. And so there are a lot of people with this real decisive feeling. So in brief, Mikyo Dorje, when he was guiding his students and nurturing his students, he had really heartfelt affection or compassion for his students. Like had the sign that of this real pure intention is that. So when people were putting hopes in him for Dharma or for material things, so when they came to see Mikyo Dorje, and so the people who came in asking for them, some people came asking for food and clothing, and people came asking for Dharma and empowerments and so forth. And so Mikyo Dorje himself, without any deceit or without any guile, Mikyo Dorje would treat them well with both just Dharma, would do as much as he could to sustain them, both in terms of the Dharma and in terms of the material things. Even in the evening, when he was going to bed in the evening, or no matter what he was doing, he was always doing something to benefit other sentient beings, giving Dharma to those who wanted Dharmas, giving material things to people who want material things or need material things. Some of them, some people didn't really actually want Dharma, but they actually had worldly aims. When they came to Mikyo Dorje, they would pretend that they're coming to get Dharma and practice the Dharma. And they said Mikyo Dorje was a really important Lama at that time in Tibet. The Karmapa was like the most important or the most well-known Lama in Tibet. And so they'd come to him. And if they'd ask for empowerments and transmissions and so forth, and they say, oh, in the future, oh, I got this teaching, they'd boast to others, I got this empowerment, this Dharma from the Karmapa, and try to build themselves up by doing this. And for people like that, then, so there were people who came to Mikyo Dorje with that sort of a thought and intention. And so in order to kind of like mollify or placate these people, no matter what they would do, you just do whatever he could to teach them and mollify them then. Since their attitude was not good, they spent a lot of time for them And they'd waste a lot of his own time for, most of their time for practicing accumulation and purification, and it would interrupt Mika Dorje's other many activities to benefit others, and to waste everyone's time. And so Mika Dorje had wasted a lot of his own time for his own activity, then the other person would be accumulating a misdeed. And so for that reason, for those people who didn't really have pure intentions and actions, he really wouldn't give them much. He didn't take much attention to them. He didn't pay attention to them. Now, if there's someone who really wanted to practice the Dharma from their heart, who really wanted to practice Dharma from the bottom of their heart, and even if they didn't have such a great wish to practice Dharma at the moment, but in the future, if the Mika Dorje thought that there'd be someone who would turn into a good practitioner in the future, like there were some receptive students, it's like really receptive. If there's a good student who comes, then Mika Dorje would pay a lot of attention to them. He would really do the best that he could for them. Forget about anything else. It spent a lot of time just speaking about things, having conversations, or even doing jokes or playing around with them. Like they just spend the time joking around with them. Of course, he'd teach them the Dharma, but even he'd spend time just taking by them, having ordinary conversation and kind of joking around with them and then laughing with them. And he spent a lot of time doing this. In order to benefit them, in order to improve their minds. And so when we look at this, the way we see that, you can sort of understand what Mika Dorje was like, right? He wanted to see, is that person really someone who's going to practice the Dharma? Is this someone who in the future really can practice the Dharma? If Mika Dorje knows that the person is like that, then of course he'd give that person the Dharma. Even when he didn't give the Dharma, they'd spend a lot of time with them, doing all sorts of things, the haha and he laughing, then enjoying time, joking around and horsing around with the other. If the other person didn't really have the wish, but because for karma posita, they'd go just because it's what you're supposed to do, and they say, is it better for me to get this empowerment? If they think that I can then base the people who would that he thought would boast of it, then in the future, the Mika Dorje know that because he was really clever, and he'd know that. And so for the short time, he'd say, "Oh yeah, I teach them," but he wouldn't really teach them well. He wouldn't spend much time with them. So that's how it is. So that's the completion of the 27th good deed. And so the next is the 28th good deed. Now, the 28th good deed is according to the outline, how we trained in the ways of all bodhisattvas. The root text reads, therefore, since all the activities of entering the ways of enlightenment are inconceivable, I made the prayer to follow in harmony with the deeds of all the bodhisattvas. I think of this as one of my good deeds. So this 28th good deed is about the training in the ways of the bodhisattvas, training in the conduct of the bodhisattvas. So whatever the behavior or conduct of the bodhisattvas, and you take it as an example and then doing that some of the stuff, that is what we mean by training in the ways of all bodhisattvas. Mika Dorje's collected works, there is Mika Dorje's text, Instructions in Training, and his life story. And if we describe this verse according to that, so as I was saying before, in order to tame others' beings, you first have to tame your own being. In order to cleanse and purify another beings, you have to cleanse and improve your own mind. Otherwise, if you're before your own mind has been improved and become clean, you think you do something to help other people's mind, it's just overconfidence. So for that reason, you need to recognize what your faults and recognize them as faults and recognize your qualities as qualities. And the faults, you need to do whatever you can to decrease them. And the qualities, you need to do whatever you can to increase them. That's what you should do. However, so you need to be able to do what you can to abandon the faults within your beings. Even if you only have a few qualities, you need to do what you can to even consider them important. And you need to do what you can to improve them. But for others, if you're thinking about it, if you're looking out at others, it's a little different. Because what you should do when you see faults in someone else, you should just make sure to you see the fault in others, should hold that to be a fault. You shouldn't hold that to be a fault. And there's a real point there. And the point here is that we're only seeing other people's faults. We're always seeing their faults. But it's not easy to see your own faults and our faults. You think that all the faults are other people's faults, and we don't think we have any faults ourselves. It's like we don't take a responsibility for themselves. We think like everything else is someone else's fault. The other people didn't do it right. We think, I'm always all right. I'm never making mistakes. That's what we normally think, right? So when you see faults in other people, instead of looking at only as a fault, if you do look at it as a fault, then and you think of yourself as having the conceit of having qualities and think that I'm okay. If you think I'm okay like that, that's really dangerous for us. And the danger is, as we're always talking about other people's faults, we're always criticizing other people. You say, shouldn't do this, you can't do that. And we're always blaming others. That's the danger. And you get really proud of yourself. I think I'm always fine, I'm always right. And you have that pride, right? There are many different types of pride, right? So I'm thinking about the different types of pride, but thinking I'm right, I'm not making mistakes. And that's a really dangerous situation in particular. If we're unlucky and the person we're criticizing or we're seeing the fault of, if that person turns out to be a bodhisattva, then it's even worse. The bodhisattvas, in order to benefit other sentient beings without any doubt or without any hopes or fears, there are sentient beings who appear in different ways. And when you see the sentient beings, you look at their actions, and some of them things that we can't get our minds around. We don't understand that it's bodhisattva activity, and so in many situations like that. And because we don't understand that, because we don't understand or don't respect it, so we develop wrong views. When you develop the wrong views, then it'll destroy many roots of virtue we have accumulated. In other words, that they won't bear any result because we will have just criticized a bodhisattva. If we criticize or despise a bodhisattva, that's a really great danger. So until we come to the point where we have the clairvoyance of telepathy and are able to read other people's minds, so like other people's minds, we can recognize what that person thinking really is. We can understand the level of that other person's thoughts. So that's just a clairvoyance of telepathy, right? This clairvoyance of telepathy, then you can tell They really know exactly how their person's thinking, what their aim is, or the level of their being. And so we can see it as we can know it as clear as like we're seeing it with our eyes. And in order to achieve such sort of a clairvoyance, we're kind of just guessing. And we're thinking, looking at the external things with our five senses and we're just saying, we're holding our five senses to be authoritative. We aren't thinking, we don't have any greater advance in that. But our five senses deceive us all the times. So think about, are they authoritative or not? Are they valid or not? When you talk about scientists, do they talk about our five sensory faculties? And you talk about, are they as valid or as reliable as you think? Then you said there are many times when they are actually not reliable. So until we achieve the clairvoyance of telepathy, and if we take our five senses being reliable, then we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't take them as reliable and describe other people's. We shouldn't be amazing. I found something in another thought. We shouldn't. The people who kind of enjoy looking at other people's faults, and it's very dangerous. We shouldn't look at other people in terms of faults. We should try to do as much as we can to look at their qualities. We should avoid looking at their faults and look at them in terms of their qualities, because it's easy for us to see faults in others, but it's not easy to see our own faults. So for that reason, we need to look at ourselves to see what our own faults are. And so it's good for us to put more effort into looking at our own faults, because it's not easy to see our own faults, but it's really easy to see others' faults. And so it's like we're always going around pointing out others' faults, then there's a danger. You're going to fall in this. In particular, if the other person is a bodhisattva, that's very dangerous. So in general, all sentient beings have Buddha nature. Not only do they have Buddha nature, just because they have different, we need to consider important and consider sacred. And so for that reason, then the bodhisattvas who benefit others engage in benefiting others without any hopes or fears or without any wishes of their own. And so we should consider that. Think of the other sentient beings as really valuable, as really important. And of course, there are bodhisattvas who sometimes are not so skilled in means. So we can't say that all bodhisattvas are skilled. Not all bodhisattvas are on the levels, right? There are bodhisattvas. It's possible that there be bodhisattvas who are not skilled in means, or bodhisattvas who haven't much prajna. In any case, the other person is the bodhisattva is a person, right? So it's quite possible that they're going to make mistakes from time to time. Possible that they'll make mistakes, but in comparison to sentient beings, the bodhisattva in comparison to a regular person is actually like an inexhaustible source of qualities, because of the bodhisattva has many sentient other beings and thinking about other beings. Because there's really focusing on the needs of many innumerable sentient beings. Compared to the many regular sentient beings, just a really important example of really very significant. And so for that reason, it's important for bodhisattvas to look at the qualities of Buddhism, but we don't know whether the other person is a bodhisattva or not. So the best thing is to just look at other sentient beings in terms of their qualities is the best, because we aren't able to know who's a bodhisattva and who is not. So this is what he says. Likewise, in Mikkyö Dorji's 100 Short Instructions, it says the same thing. For example, it says, I'm talking about in terms of worldly things, and what's if there's someone who has and they don't have good vision, they don't have such a nice looking face, or maybe if like the people who are disabled, if you call them all sorts of names, or if you don't, if you can't call them by disparaging names. If you speak about them through worldly faults, then it really kind of offends the other person, right? And so in English, we talk about this as discrimination, and if we do this, it's not good, right? Likewise, in terms of the Dharma, we have like people who have violations of discipline. They're faults, right? It's like you shouldn't like bring out the other person's faults to show it to other people. In brief, you should never think anything about anyone else's faults. You should look at their faults. We have to stop looking at their faults. But what you should do if you happen to see a fault in someone else, sometimes you do see faults. And you think, oh, that really is a fault. You see it, you think that really is a fault. And when you see a fault, what should you do? When you see the fault, you must make the aspiration, may that person never have such a fault ever again. And may I never see such faults in the future. We're talking about in terms of the mind only. Actually, it's not mind only, but it's when we're looking at the other sentient being, we're seeing a fault in the other person. It's because of a karmic connection that we see it as a fault. Not everyone's going to see that. Some people will see that person has faults, and some people see that they won't see that they have faults. And so because of each individual's imprints, or because of their karmic connections, people see different people in different ways. At the very least, if you look at the color blue, if you have 100 people looking at the color blue, it's the same that we're all looking at blue, but each person the blue that each person sees, like the blue that I see and the blue that another person is going to be different. There are a lot of explanations, and we don't need to go into all those complicated explanations, but in case, based upon your own imprints and confusion, and because of the way your confusion works, because of your karma and afflictions and imprints, you're going to see everyone has different ways of seeing things. And because we have a bad way of seeing things is because of our own karma and afflictions. Buddhas and bodhisattvas who have exhausted all their karma and afflictions don't see other people as bad, right? So even seeing that is, for one thing, when we see it in fault in something bad in some other person, from one perspective, it may be a fault in it, but it's also a fault in ourselves. And so we must pray in the future never to see a fault again. In particular, no matter whatever affliction sentient beings has, they should try their hardest to try to eliminate that first. If your pride is really strong, you should try to work hard to eliminate pride first. And when you're taking teachings from a guru, then you should tell your guru what the great affliction is. You say, I have the pride. You might think to yourself, it wouldn't be good if that the guru sees that I'm so prideful and they hide it. You shouldn't do that. Instead, if whatever you have, affliction you should explain it to the guru. And the guru should then teach you whatever dharma, teach all the dharma, gathering it all together as like the antidote for that one affliction. I'd like to give an example of this. Like when you're practicing the dharma, it's like going to war. So what you need to do when you're going to go wage war, so what's important is that you have to have different methods. And the method is, say, from the outside, you have to surround it from the outside, and then from the inside, then what you need to do is you need to have spies in there who are going to create dissent and foment dissent in that, and get them into, and if they from the outside they are divided and they have a revolt inside, then the outside, then you have the inside and the outside working together, and you can overcome and beat the other country. Likewise, when you were on the outside, when you're going to war against the afflictions, you have to the forces and the armies of the gurus and the dharma, like having tens of thousands of soldiers You need to heap on all the antidotes as you can. And within inside you, for your own sake, you need to have a revolt inside your being. You need to look at it. If you aren't revolting inside your beings, then no matter how many outside, if everyone is united on the inside, then it's difficult to eliminate them, right? So you need to do for yourself. You need to say, oh, this is the affliction. You need to see it as a fault. You say, this is not good. This is bad. You have to be like you're revolting against the afflictions on the inside. And that way, then the outside and the inside come together. And in this way, then you'll be able to suppress the afflictions. Now, here's a thought that can come up. And this is said inside the 100 short instructions. And what this doubt that people have is that it's true if you're seeing, something that's good as being bad. That's right. It's exactly right. When you're seeing something good and seeing everything that's not a fault as being a fault, that's exactly what you say. But if you see someone who has a fault and you see that as a fault, then what's the wrong with that? If you see a fault as being a fault, then what's wrong with that? And sometimes when you tell a person, you say, this is your fault, and you criticize them, they say, so what's wrong with that? That people say. Now, when someone has a fault, you should point it out to others. If you said that it's a fault, and you said it's not a fault, then that's not good. So if this is how you think, but this is not certain. For example, there are some people who have accumulated misdeeds in terms of committing misdeeds. A person, may have accumulated a lot of misdeeds in terms of making mistakes. And so, in terms of their performing misdeeds and making mistakes, we criticize them for that. That's one thing, but that same person has also done good things, and so it's important for us actually to be able to distinguish the individual from their mistakes. They're the misdeeds that the individual has committed, or the mistakes. You can see those as being mistakes, but that's not. But because of those, if you see that other person is being completely bad, then that's not okay. Because if you do that, the problem with that is by criticizing the other person as being a bad person, making them into a completely bad person, and saying that they're terrible and seeing them as a horrible person, then the virtuous qualities they have in their qualities are naturally also. What happens to them is, and so you aren't respecting them. It's possible that this person has virtuous qualities. Like an example of this is, if you have a Buddha statue made of clay, and if you destroy it, and we say you have the misdeed of destroying a Buddha's body, but the Buddha statue made of clay is not actually the Buddha's kaya. It's not a Buddha, right? But when you destroy the Buddha statue made of clay, then you get then it's said that you say misdeed of destroying the Buddha's body, the same as doing. Because when you're destroying the Buddha statue that is made of clay, then there is the non-composite kaya body that is there in the form of like the supporter and supported, that also is being destroyed. And so in that reason, it is said to be the same as destroying the kaya of a Buddha, because the question of the supporter and the supported. And so that is what it is like. In any case, in the world, there are good sentient beings who perform bad actions that actually then have benefit other sentient beings. And sometimes they're a horrible person that actually do things, but it can also become harmful. When a bad person does a good thing, then it can also be something that destroys the teachings of the Buddha. So the question of good and bad is something that's very difficult for us to actually quickly determine. So this is something we have to be extremely careful of. That we can't just immediately decide something is good and something is bad. And in particular, we don't know who is a bodhisattva. If that person is a bodhisattva, and if we, with a feeling of hatred, we get angry and hatred from them, then we criticize them for that, then that's a huge misdeed. In fact, there's a sutra called the Noble Mahayana Sutra called Entering the Seal of the Determinate Indeterminate Beings. What it says is that if you were to gouge out the eyes of all sentient beings in the realms of the 10 directions, if you feel hatred for a sentient being, you look at them wrong, that's actually even worse. And so for that reason, we need to be very careful that a bodhisattva, we don't know who a bodhisattva is. It's possible that they're bodhisattvas among ants. It's possible that there are bodhisattvas among cats and dogs. It's not necessary that a bodhisattva be human. So we shouldn't look at anyone in terms of, if we can make a good virtuous connection to them, it's good. If we can make good connections to all of them, if we are unable to make good sentient beings, we should at least just suspend judgment. We shouldn't, in terms of attachment or aversion, divide them in people. It's not good for us to develop bias among people like that. There was a spiritual Kadampa spiritual from Nirasupa, and he said something that we should really keep in our minds. What he says is that, this is the main point here. These days, the way people think is that, I said, is it basically when they've they've run out of Dharma to practice. There's nothing left to practice. There's nothing to do. They do what they can to get whatever Dharma they can. It's like they do whatever they get, any teaching they can. They get empowerments, they get transmissions, they try to do everything, they get all the Dharma that they. It's any Dharma that they try to do what they can to get that. They get a lot of Dharma teachings, but they request all the teachings they can, but they don't say, I've practiced this one. I haven't practiced that one. They never talk about this. There's not even any feeling for that. This is like enough to just have taken impossible. When you think about empowerments, it's like once the guru has put the vase on your head, you think that's enough. That's okay. I'm all right. I'm fine. And they do what they can to get the vases put on their head as many times as they can. And when the guru is giving a transmission, then they do what they can to get in there and take that. They think that that's enough. Actually, when the guru gave this empowerment, gave this transmission, gave this teaching, I need to practice this, is what we should think. If we don't practice, if you take so many empowerments, receive so many energies, then it's all like empty. It's like it's all a waste. But there aren't any people who think like this. The situation in addition to that, everyone says, I should go for refuge, I go for refuge to the gurus. Everyone says this. But in their actual lives, what they do, whether it's a lama or a master or a teacher or a sangha, there's like none that they won't criticize. From the mouths, they would go for refuge to everyone, but in their actual lifetime, saying that's not okay, that's not all right. And it's like there's no one among the sangha, among the khenpos and lamas that they won't criticize. And so when they say these poisonous lips will cast us into hell, we don't need anything. It's all the only thing that we need to go to hell are the lips. And so for that reason, so Nirasupa said, if there was someone who really cared for me, what they'd do, they'd put a lock on my mouth, take and give the lock to someone else. The lock, they give the key to someone else. Now, when I have to eat, then they'd unlock it. Otherwise, if your mouth is locked closed, you can't eat. So when it comes to meal times, then they'd go get the key from the other person and bring the key back, then open it. But otherwise, just always it's better if they just leave it my mouth locked closed all the time, because these lips will pointlessly give ourselves a hard time. This is what Supa said. It's really something we can understand. So I think that you think about this is something that can benefit us. So I think that's probably enough. This is a good time to leave it today. There's still more to say, but maybe that's enough. That's what we will leave it for today. In any case, as I said the other day, today's the final day of the spring teachings, but we'll continue with this teaching. So today is the end of the spring teachings, and after a few days, all the people who are at spring teaching need to return to their own nunneries, and so that takes a few days. So we'll take a few days off. And if we look at our current plans are to we will resume on the 13th and continue with the teachings. And then I think we probably need to change the time of the teachings, but I'll announce that later. In any case, I'm going to continue these teachings until the autobiographical good verses and the praises thirdly continue, or until we've completed them. I will continue the teachings.